Here's the full English translation of your transcript. Timestamps. Removed as you requested. On April 13, 1970, nearly 400,000 kilometers away from Earth aboard a spacecraft, a loud explosion occurred. They could neither land at their destination nor return home. The astronauts were in sheer panic. Yet, they didn't know that the worst had not even begun. Music in the late 1950s. The Cold War had entered a tense phase. Besides the arms race, the United States and the Soviet Union had another race, the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by successfully launching the first artificial satellite into space. Just 2 years later, it achieved another milestone when pilot Yuri Gagarin became the first human to fly into space, not wanting to be left behind. President John Kennedy declared applause that this goal must immediately turn into action. Massive budgets poured into NASA, triggering an unprecedented campaign. All of it was just to start a race. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong successfully set foot on the moon for the first time. The Apollo 11 spacecraft became a new symbol in humanity's mission to conquer space. Building on that victory, NASA pushed forward with new space programs. The Apollo 12 project was carried out successfully, expanding exploration zones on the moon. More than 4 months later, Apollo 13 was chosen as the next mission with the goal of landing in the Fra Mauro region. This was an ancient geological area where researchers hoped to find traces of the moon's early formation. Apollo 13 consisted of 3 main modules. At the center was the command module, the crew's main living and working space. At the front was the lunar module, designed for landing on the surface. The large cylindrical section was the service module, containing the propulsion engine and oxygen tanks that sustained life. In the second half of the mission, this part would orbit the moon. Waiting to reconnect with the module launched from the surface, the crew of the mission had 3 members. Jim Lovell was one of the most experienced astronauts in the world at the time. With 3 previous missions and a total of 572 hours in space, he had also played an important role in Apollo 8, the first mission to orbit the moon. Then there was Fred Hayes, who had previously served as backup lunar module pilot for Apollo 8 and Apollo 11 before joining NASA. He served as a U.S. Marine Corps fighter pilot. Apollo 13 was his only mission into space. Finally, there was Jack Swigert, the command module pilot. Just 48 hours before launch, he was unexpectedly added to the crew after a primary member was pulled out due to exposure to measles. This was also Swigert's first trip into space. At 2:37 p.m. on April 11, 1970, Apollo 13 lifted off from the launch pad. However, its journey did not attract much attention. Perhaps the 2 previous missions had made spaceflight seem too routine. During the first 2 days after launch, the spacecraft operated normally on its way to the moon, at nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour. They executed a 180-degree maneuver to detach the command module from the rocket and dock it with the lunar module. The spacecraft then officially entered its trajectory toward the moon. At Mission Control in Houston, communications officers reported that Apollo 13 was in good condition. He even joked with the crew that things were so quiet down there they might cry. At 55 to 46 hours after launch, the broadcast of Apollo 13's journey ended. The spacecraft was now 322,000 kilometers from Earth, with the moon just ahead. But on the 3rd day, Apollo 13 suddenly faced a crisis. At Mission Control, flight controllers noticed a warning signal. The pressure in one of the spacecraft's hydrogen tanks was dropping to resolve the issue. Engineers suggested that the crew turn on the fans and slightly heat the tank. This procedure, called cryostir, was normally done once a day to ensure stable system performance. After receiving instructions, Swigert flipped the switch as usual. Seconds later, the spacecraft shook violently. After checking readings and talking with Mission Control, the crew suspected the spacecraft might have hit a meteorite. However, that theory was quickly dismissed based on observations from controllers. A far more serious problem emerged. The spacecraft was losing oxygen. The explosion had crippled the service module, and with it, the command module that depended on it was also affected. Commander Lovell immediately reported to Mission Control. On the ground, engineers were stunned by the data screens. Warning lights showed that 2 of the 3 fuel cells had failed. This system provided electricity, cooled equipment, and even produced drinking water for the astronauts. One oxygen tank was completely empty. The remaining one was dropping rapidly. If this continued, the crew's survival would be at risk. Inside, the 3 astronauts still thought they could manage. But just minutes later, all hope was dashed. Lovell happened to glance out the left window and saw a stream of white gas venting into space. It was oxygen escaping from the last remaining tank. Their only lifeline was vanishing into the void. The spacecraft continued drifting toward the moon. At Mission Control, engineers decided to initiate emergency protocols for fuel cell failure. The system was reduced to minimum power, shutting off all non-essential equipment and keeping only what was needed to sustain life. When the accident happened, American television stations quickly switched to emergency coverage. Just hours after the explosion, news reports on the space crisis spread everywhere. The U.S. president immediately canceled scheduled meetings. He convened a group of scientific advisors and ordered NASA to save the crew at all costs, even amid the Cold War. The Soviet government sent an official message, offering technical assistance if requested. A quick solution was to fire the engine and turn the spacecraft back toward Earth. But Commander Lovell believed this was not optimal. The reason, the command module's main engine might have been damaged by the explosion if they tried to ignite it. The risk of another failure was high. Moreover, the oxygen supply was still sufficient for now. Lovell requested that Mission Control calculate all possible options for the next 3 days. One proposed plan was a direct rescue, launching another spacecraft to the moon to retrieve the stranded crew. However, that distance was far too great. Preparing such a mission would take months, even years. The crew did not have the luxury of waiting, as water, electricity, and oxygen were rapidly running out. This plan was immediately rejected. Another idea was Earth orbit rendezvous. NASA would launch 2 Saturn rockets, simultaneously one carrying a rescue spacecraft, the other carrying fuel. Both would meet in Earth orbit, where the rescue ship would be refueled to reach the moon in return. Theoretically possible, but like the first plan, Apollo 13 did not have enough oxygen to wait. The crew couldn't remain idle for instructions. In just 15 minutes, the service module's oxygen and power would be depleted. They decided to quickly move into the lunar module. Commander Lovell knew this was not an ideal shelter. It was designed to support only 2 people for 48 hours. Given the situation, all hopes of landing on the moon were gone. 1 hour and 29 minutes after the explosion, the decision was made. The crew must use the lunar module as a lifeboat, but that was only a temporary solution. They were still in space. How could they maintain oxygen? What if power ran out? What about food and water? Who would guide them when most systems were failing? Inside the cabin, the temperature dropped below freezing. No one knew if the navigation instruments could withstand the harsh cold. The most urgent task was to correct their course. The explosion had thrown Apollo 13 off trajectory. If left uncorrected, the crew would slingshot past the moon and drift endlessly into space. The only available system to adjust course was the lunar module's descent engine. But it wasn't designed to pull the entire spacecraft weighing tens of tons. Worse, the command module still attached behind caused imbalance. When the crew tried to turn left, the spacecraft pitched forward, then veered right. The entire system responded chaotically. Flying the spacecraft was like driving a car with an inverted steering system, yet the astronauts had no choice but to try. They performed a 35-second burn to increase speed. But ground calculations showed that power and water would run out before they could return. How could they speed up without consuming more energy? The spacecraft's onboard computers were extremely limited. In 1970, Intel hadn't even invented the first microprocessor. The Apollo guidance system stored only a few thousand characters and had less computing power than an early Nokia phone. Therefore, all calculations had to be done on Earth. Controllers then sent precise instructions on when to fire the engine, what thrust level, and for how long. The crew had to copy every line before signal loss. After analyzing all options, Mission Control recommended a new 5-minute burn to shorten the trip by nearly a day. Even so, remaining resources were insufficient for a safe return. Data showed consumption rising dangerously, while energy and water neared critical levels. The main problem was the inertial guidance system. The biggest power drain in the lunar module, some engineers suggested turning it off. But flight directors objected. Without guidance, the crew would lose control of the spacecraft. After reviewing all data, the team had to choose. Survival required sacrifice. They decided to keep the navigation system on just long enough for the final correction.
Afterward, all non-essential systems were shut down. The spacecraft entered total silence. No lights, no engines, no heating. Apollo 13 drifted for 3 days. To save water, the astronauts cut intake to 1/5 of normal. Even urine was stored in plastic bags instead of being dumped. They became dehydrated, hungry, and exhausted in the freezing cabin. Hayes even developed a urinary tract infection and fever. His crewmates huddled against him for warmth. But the nightmare wasn't over. The 3 men were producing too much CO2. The lunar module's scrubbers were nearly used up, while the command module still had plenty. But the 2 systems were incompatible. The lunar module used round canisters, while the command module's spares were square. Engineers had to improvise to save the crew. But how do you fit a square peg into a round hole in zero gravity with no proper tools? Time was running out. They still needed 2 days to get back. Mission Control quickly built a model using plastic bags, cardboard, tubing, and duct tape. The device resembled a mailbox. But successful testing was only the first step. The hardest part was guiding the astronauts to assemble it by hand under harsh conditions. Engineers described every detail carefully. The crew followed slowly, sealing joints, wrapping tape, attaching tubes exactly as instructed, ensuring no leaks. There was no room for error. One mistake would ruin everything. When the device was finished and activated, airflow resumed, CO2 levels dropped, and the astronauts' lives were temporarily saved. Still, how would they re-enter Earth's atmosphere safely? To return, Apollo 13 had to hit Earth's atmosphere at an angle no shallower than 5.3 and no steeper than 7.7. At 5.2 or less, the spacecraft would skip off the atmosphere and drift into solar orbit, never to return. It was like skipping a stone across water. It bounces instead of sinking. At 7.8 or more, the spacecraft might return, but the steep angle and friction would cause it to burn up before splashdown. Another difficulty: manual control was required. They had to steer by eye, keeping Earth centered in the window. Commander Lovell knew he couldn't do it alone, since control required roll, pitch, and yaw. Swigert kept the spacecraft from tilting left or right. Hayes handled rotation. Lovell kept Earth aligned in sight. At his side were 2 switches: start and stop. One ignited the engine, the other shut it off. In the entire Apollo program, this was the only time they were used. At Swigert's signal, Lovell pressed start. 14 seconds later, Hayes shouted, "Stop!" During those moments, the crew worked together to correct their path. Then silence followed. No one knew if their calculations were accurate enough to bring them home. The final challenge was reactivating the frozen command module. To power up its systems, they had to follow an entirely new sequence never tested before. Normally, this would take months to design and validate. But in this emergency, engineers on Earth prepared it in just 3 days, 9 hours before re-entry. The spacecraft sped toward Earth at over 32,000 km/h. In the cramped cabin, the men scribbled notes on food wrappers and notebook backs. The whole system was running at bare minimum, near its limit. The cold had nearly frozen batteries and threatened to cripple fuel lines. Even if they made it back, no one was sure the command module would function again. The situation was life or death. There was no turning back. When they flipped the switch, everyone held their breath. The impossible happened. The entire system came back online. The crew quickly separated the service module from the command module. Looking outside, they saw the extent of the damage. One side of the spacecraft was completely blown away. But a greater fear remained. If the heat shield had been damaged, re-entry would incinerate them in seconds. Nevertheless, the return had to begin. The spacecraft plunged into the atmosphere and immediately lost radio contact. Mission Control watched every passing second. 3 minutes of silence, as predicted, but then more time passed with no response. The room grew tense. Some feared the spacecraft had burned up. Then a voice came through the speakers, just a single word. The room erupted in joy. On April 17, 1970, after 142 hours, 54 minutes, and 41 seconds, all 3 Apollo 13 crew members safely splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. An incredible ending to a journey hailed as a miracle of the century. Later, the cause of the accident was confirmed to be electrical. While modifying oxygen tank number 1 for Apollo 13, the heater voltage was raised from 28 V to 65 V, but the thermal switch was not updated. During the final test before launch, the Teflon insulation was damaged. That was the source of the short circuit that triggered the devastating explosion. Although the mission failed, Apollo 13 was remembered as a successful failure. It left invaluable lessons for space engineering and laid the foundation for future missions. More importantly, Apollo 13 stood as a great testament to the intelligence, courage, and extraordinary ingenuity of its 3 astronauts and the NASA team.